Many of you today may think that your job is horrible, but I can tell you now that compared to jobs in history, it definitely will not compare. Gong farmers. You can sort of tell what this job involves. A day in the life of a gong farmer, or should I say a night in the life, as gong farmers only worked at night, and this was by law. They had to haul human waste from cesspits beneath homes or public places. They actually had to climb into the pit with a shovel and bucket up to their knees in raw sewage, and they carried these buckets full of human waste through the streets, often dumping them outside of city limits or on farms. As you can probably imagine, they constantly smell all the time, and they could never get rid of the smell. And many of these people weren't even allowed into churches or public places. So not only were you shoveling poo all night, every night, you also weren't even allowed to go see your friends or family in the church. Next up, we have the plague doctor. Now, this involved visiting homes of the infected, which you can imagine was very dangerous. However, you did get to wear a pretty cool mask, them famous beaked ones, and these were filled with herbs that were believed to help with disease. They carried long sticks to poke patients with, which I'm sure worked, or this was used to lift bed sheets or examine bodies without actually touching them, or were responsible for tallying up the dead, which could add up to hundreds a day. And they used the very scientific method of using leeches for bloodletting to try and help people recover from diseases. Often this was during the time of the Black Death, which we know now didn't really work. Essentially, they were grim record keepers. Most of these plague doctors died very quickly because of exposure to diseases such as the Black Death or the plague. And no surprise, but society often saw these people as very creepy and cursed. Canal and railway workers. Your day started at dawn. You worked 12 plus hours a day, digging into the earth with pickaxes and shovels. You had to carry very heavy wheelbarrows full of soil, rock, or explosives, and you were often living in muddy makeshift camps with bad food, no hygiene, and frequent accidents. Now, this does sound pretty cool, but they were blowing up things with dynamite without wearing any safety gear or training, so you can imagine where problems occurred. There were always risks of explosions, caves collapsing, and therefore you suffocating or even drowning, and many of these workers died in the thousands. Radium girls. Now, radium girls weren't the name of superheroes. These were girls who sat in factories, painting tiny numbers on watch dials, using radioactive paint made from radium, and were told to lip point brushes, which meant putting them in their mouth for precision. And they often took these paint brushes with this radioactive paint home with them and decorated their nails and teeth as the paint glowed in the dark. As you can imagine, they frequently got radiation poisoning, and even their bones disintegrated and teeth fell out, and many women were dying very young. Rat catchers. Rat catchers were involved with scouring alleys and sewers with dogs or ferrets to hunt and trap rats. They often use poison, smoke, or their bare hands, and therefore a lot of the time they got bitten or scratched, and from this would get infected. They could be seen carrying around sacks of squirming rats. However, they could make money off these as they sold them for rat fighting to taverns and pub owners, and kids would follow them around cheering them on. So they were somewhat town celebrities. However, as rats are very dirty and are no joke, they often got the bubonic plague, tetanus, and horrible infections, and you probably wouldn't really want to be known as someone who catches rats for a living. A tanner. Now, this may seem like someone who sits out in the sun all day, has perfect golden skin. However, they were actually responsible for soaking animal hides in urine and dog feces for days, so not as extravagant as it sounds. They would use knives to scrape rotting flesh from the hides and treated hides in stinking pits to create usable leather, and on top of this they were waddling around barefoot in the mix. Unsurprisingly, towns wanted them far away, so they often had to work in isolated areas, and they often experienced chemical burns, diseases, skin infections, and due to the smell were constantly gagging. Executioner. Now, this one may seem quite like a cool job to some of you sick people out there. as they often practiced beheadings or hangings and got to maintain the sharpening of weapons such as swords, axes, and even ropes. And their main role was to perform executions in public squares for everyone to watch. However, they would be sometimes under extreme pressure to get a clean strike, and some of these executioners even had a side hustle in torturing or undertaking. As you can imagine, many people feared and even hated these executioners, even though at the end of the day, they were just doing their job. Next up, we have the Roman mind slave. Now, this was less of a job and more of a form of slow execution. They were chained underground for life, and they were set to dig ore with stone tools in no light, poor air, and unbearable heat, forever eating and sleeping underground, and were forced to carry heavy loads whilst being whipped by guards, and mine shafts were constantly collapsing or filling with toxic gas. And finally, arguably the worst job is a matchstick girl. Now, you might be wondering what a matchstick girl actually did. Basically, what they were in charge of was sitting at a bench every day, dipping matchsticks into white phosphorus paste, breathing in fumes all day, and ate lunch right where they worked without even washing their hands. Now, the reason that this is a bad job is because phosphorus rots the jawbone from the inside out, and this was often called phossy jaw. Not only were they working long shifts and being paid pennies, they had no protection or ventilation, and often experienced slow, agonizing bone death and disfigurement. And on top of this, if they got sick, they were simply fired. So if you're stuck in traffic and you're dreading going to work in the morning, just be thankful that your office isn't making your jaw rot, just your brain.